They called themselves a brotherhood, guided by scripture yet baptized in blood. In the heart of Michoacán, La Familia Michoacana rose from chaos, preaching redemption with one hand and dealing death with the other. Their commandments promised order, but every verse hid a blade waiting to strike in God's name. In the early 2000s, as Mexico's war on drugs reached new levels of brutality, a different kind of cartel began to form in the rugged hills of Michoacán. It did not emerge from the streets of Sinaloa or the border cities, but from the deep rural valleys, where farmers, preachers, and ex-police officers watched their land descend into anarchy. Out of that chaos rose La Familia Michoacana, a syndicate that called itself righteous, claiming to protect the people from the very evil it came to embody. Its founder, Nazario Moreno Gonzalez, known as Almas Loco, believed he was chosen by God to cleanse the land. He was a man of contradictions, a killer who preached morality, a trafficker who forbade his men from using the drugs they sold. Moreno gathered his followers in secret meetings, where he spoke of divine purpose and brotherhood. He handed out small books containing his personal teachings, written in the tone of a prophet. They called it pensamientos, and its pages mixed verses from the Bible with his own declarations of loyalty, sacrifice, and faith. It became the spiritual backbone of La Familia, binding killers to a cause that felt bigger than profit. Every recruit was told that the cartel did not exist to destroy, but to bring justice where the government had failed. They prayed before missions. They invoked God before pulling the trigger. Before La Familia, Michoacán had long been a contested ground. It was a gateway between the Pacific coast and central Mexico, a corridor for methamphetamine production and transport. Local traffickers had always existed, but the vacuum left by federal neglect created space for something new. When the Zetas began to expand into the region, their methods were ruthless. Kidnappings, extortion, executions. Towns that once lived quietly under local codes were consumed by fear. Moreno and his allies used that chaos as justification for war. They positioned themselves as defenders of Michoacán's dignity, driving the Zetas out through ambushes and assassinations. By 2006, La Familia had become both a social and criminal force. They controlled meth labs scattered through the countryside, exporting vast quantities north into the United States. Yet they also built a network of community ties, sponsoring local festivals, funding churches, and paying for schools. To many villagers, they seemed less like a cartel and more like a parallel government. Their members patrolled roads, settled disputes, and punished thieves. But behind that facade of order lay the same machinery of terror that defined every major cartel. Their recruits were trained with military discipline. Initiates were often brought to remote camps where they were lectured on loyalty and obedience. Some were forced to watch executions as part of their indoctrination. They were told that betrayal was the greatest sin, punishable by death without mercy. Every act of violence was framed as an act of purification. Those who questioned commands were reminded that they served a divine plan. Moreno's second in command, José de Jesus Menéndez Vargas, known as El Chango, managed the organization's finances and logistics. Together they built a structure that combined spirituality with business precision. Methamphetamine became their lifeblood. Michoacán's rural isolation made it easy to hide labs and airstrips. The cartel established alliances with producers in Guerrero and smugglers in the north, ensuring their product flowed through the same routes once dominated by Sinaloa. In July 2006, La Familia made its presence known to the entire country in one shocking act. During a night of chaos in Uruapan, cartel gunmen stormed a nightclub, killing rivals and tossing 5 severed heads onto the dance floor. Beside them lay a note: La Familia doesn't kill for money. It kills for divine justice. The message was clear. They wanted Mexico to know they were not just another criminal group. They were soldiers of faith, The act horrified the nation, but also cemented their reputation as a force unlike any other. When President Felipe Calderon took office later that year, he launched an aggressive campaign against cartels, starting with Michoacán. Soldiers and federal police flooded the region, but La Familia's influence ran deep. Their ties to local officials and police departments allowed them to stay one step ahead. In many towns, law enforcement quietly cooperated, either through fear or loyalty. The cartel responded to government pressure with ambushes and propaganda, distributing leaflets that promised protection for civilians and warned against corruption. They cast themselves as moral warriors in a war of evil. Inside the organization, however, the moral code began to fracture. The wealth from meth trafficking grew immense, and with it came disputes and rivalries. Moreno's obsession with spiritual control clashed with the ambitions of his lieutenants. El Chango favored a pragmatic approach, less preaching, more profit. Their divide deepened after 2009, as federal forces intensified their campaign and arrests mounted. Yet Moreno's followers refused to abandon his teachings. They spoke of him as if he were a saint, a man who could not die even when bullets found him. In December 2010, authorities announced that Nazario Moreno had been killed during a firefight with federal forces. The government declared victory, displaying his death as proof that the war on drugs was working. But his body was never recovered, and rumors spread across Michoacán that El Mas Loco was still alive. His followers refused to believe he was gone. They continued to quote his writings, claiming he had transcended death. In his absence, the organization splintered. El Chango Menendez took control of one faction, trying to maintain the business structure, while others formed smaller cells that blended religion with vengeance. The government's assumption of success was short-lived. Violence erupted again, now between former brothers. Towns that once saw La Familia as protectors were dragged into the chaos of internal war. Farmers who once supplied the cartel with resources were extorted by rival commanders demanding loyalty. The police presence intensified, but so did corruption. The spiritual code that once unified the group became nothing more than a slogan used to justify new rounds of bloodshed. By 2011, La Familia had fractured beyond repair. From its ashes rose a successor that would carry its methods even further, the Knights Templar. Led by Servando Giménez Martinez, known as La Tuta. This new group claimed to inherit Moreno's ideals, combining religion, discipline, and commerce into a brutal new order. They adopted medieval imagery, wearing crosses and calling themselves guardians of Michoacán's purity. The cycle that began with faith and moral promises turned into another era of fear. As the years went on, authorities continued to find evidence of La Familia's vast reach. Meth production networks extended from Michoacán into neighboring states, supported by hidden labs and international distribution chains. The organization laundered money through avocado exports, construction companies, and local government contracts. For every sermon Moreno once gave about honor and sacrifice, there were hundreds of families mourning sons lost to his crusade. The legend of La Familia Michoacana persisted long after its leaders fell. In small villages, old members still whispered about the days when they prayed before raids, when bullets were blessed and murders justified as acts of cleansing. The line between faith and fanaticism blurred completely. What began as a movement promising redemption had transformed into one of Mexico's most notorious cartels, proving that belief, once weaponized, could become more dangerous than greed itself. When La Familia Michoacana began to crumble under internal conflict, the vacuum it left behind drew new figures hungry for power. Servando Giménez Martinez, once a school teacher, stepped forward as if fulfilling a prophecy left unfinished. Known to his followers as La Tuta, he spoke with the same moral conviction that once defined Nazario Moreno. He claimed to be the guardian of Moreno's vision, reviving the idea of a cartel guided by faith. Under his leadership, the remnants of La Familia reorganized into the Caballeros Templarios, or Knights Templar, adopting symbols of medieval chivalry and merging them with the same ruthless business of meth production and territorial control. Their emergence in 2011 marked a new phase in Michoacán's long descent into violence. La Tuta imposed a rigid hierarchy modeled after the orders of ancient warriors. Members swore oaths of loyalty and carried prayer books inscribed with moral codes. They wore crosses around their necks and held initiation ceremonies where recruits pledged to serve the people, to fight injustice, and to die if necessary for the cause. The words mirrored those of Nazario Moreno, but the world around them had changed. Federal forces were stronger, rival cartels were encroaching, and communities once sympathetic to La Familia were now wary of promises that brought only blood. Despite this, the Knights Templar quickly gained influence. They seized control of local economies, taxing everything from avocado exports to iron ore shipments leaving the port of Los Sardinas. They infiltrated municipalities, dictating who could run for office, who could trade, and who could live. Businesses paid them in silence, afraid of what defiance meant. Entire towns became dependent on their permission to function. La Tuta mastered the art of propaganda. He appeared in videos speaking calmly about justice, morality, and corruption. He presented himself not as a criminal, but as a teacher guiding lost souls. The recordings spread across Michoacán, reinforcing his myth among those who had grown up under cartel rule. Behind his image of leadership, the Knights Templar intensified extortion and trafficking. Methamphetamine flowed north through established routes into Texas and California, generating millions. Their laboratories expanded in the Sierra Madre, guarded by men who prayed before each shipment left the valley. The Mexican government launched Operation Michoacán to retake control of the region, deploying thousands of soldiers and federal police. Yet every time authorities advanced, the Knights Templar reappeared in the shadows, aided by networks of local informants and officials on their payroll. Their resilience forced civilians to choose sides. Farmers and townspeople, tired of the violence, began to form their own armed groups known as autodefenses. These self-defense forces, emerging around 2013, were made up of ordinary citizens determined to drive the Templars out. The autodefenses spread rapidly across western Michoacán, capturing towns that had been under cartel control for nearly a decade. Many were led by figures like Dr. José Manuel Morels, a rural physician who became a national symbol of defiance. They claimed no allegiance to any political party or criminal organization, though the lines between them often blurred. Some of the groups were secretly funded by rival cartels hoping to weaken the Templars' dominance. Others were genuinely formed by desperate communities trying to reclaim their lives. As the conflict intensified, La Tuta's grip began to falter. His promises of justice could not hold against growing resistance. The federal government initially tolerated the autodefenses, even arming some of them, but the cooperation was uneasy. Allegations surfaced that certain vigilante leaders had been absorbed into the same criminal networks they once fought. By 2014, the region was engulfed in chaos once again, with three forces: the Templars, the autodefenses, and the state, all clashing for control. In March 2014, Mexican Marines surrounded a compound in Tumbascatio, a remote area in Michoacán. After a brief confrontation, they announced that Nazario Moreno, who had been declared dead 4 years earlier, was killed for the second time. This time, his body was presented as proof. His death marked the end of the myth that had sustained the faith-based foundation of La Familia. Without its prophet, the movement's spiritual narrative collapsed. La Tuta continued to evade capture, moving between safe houses and protected villages. He maintained communication with his followers through videos, condemning the government and portraying himself as a victim of political persecution. His presence lingered like an echo of the old order, a man preaching righteousness while orchestrating murders and shipments of methamphetamine. Federal intelligence units tracked him relentlessly, closing in on his network of corrupt police and informants. By early 2015, the net had tightened. On February 27, Mexican federal police captured La Tuta in Morelia, the state capital. He was found living quietly in a modest house, guarded by only a few loyalists. His arrest signaled the symbolic fall of the Knights Templar, and with it, the last visible remnant of La Familia Michoacana's original leadership. The government celebrated the operation as a decisive victory, though the deeper structures of the cartel persisted. After the fall of La Tuta, smaller cells of La Familia reemerged across Michoacán, Guerrero, and the state of Mexico. These groups retained the old name, La Familia Michoacana, but now functioned as independent criminal enterprises. They continued meth production, extortion, and arms trafficking, though without the ideological framework that once defined them. In some regions, they adopted new methods, collaborating with remnants of other cartels like Los Viagras and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, adjusting allegiances according to profit and survival. The spiritual code that had once given the organization its identity disappeared, replaced by the same cold calculus of violence and commerce that dominated the drug trade nationwide. Yet even stripped of its religious facade, the legend of La Familia continued to influence newer groups. Recruits still spoke of Nazario Moreno as a visionary who combined faith and fear to control men's hearts. His writings, once distributed in secret, survived in photocopies and online scans, passed between generations of traffickers as a reminder of how power could be disguised as salvation. In the following years, the Mexican government's strategy shifted toward dismantling financial operations rather than pursuing figureheads. Authorities targeted money laundering networks linked to La Familia and the Knights Templar, uncovering shell companies and export businesses tied to cartel revenue. Despite arrests and military raids, production of methamphetamine increased. Laboratories became smaller and more mobile, moving constantly through rural terrain to evade detection. By 2018, La Familia's surviving factions were operating primarily in southern Mexico, focusing on synthetic drugs, extortion, and control of migrant routes. Their once centralized command structure had dissolved into a loose federation of local bosses. Violence flared sporadically as rival groups fought for dominance. In towns like Zitkaro and Toluca, assassinations of police chiefs and mayors marked the cartel's quiet return under new leadership. Their operations lacked the grandeur of La Tuta's rule, but retained the same efficiency born from years of survival. In 2020, reports surfaced that remnants of La Familia Michoacana had expanded into the neighboring state of Mexico, extorting businesses and battling the Jalisco New Generation cartel for control of trafficking corridors. The conflict reignited memories of the organization's brutal past. Federal forces once again deployed to stabilize the region, encountering the same resistance and corruption that had haunted previous campaigns. Today, La Familia Michoacana exists as a shadow of its former self, yet its influence remains embedded in Mexico's criminal landscape. The group's transformation from a religiously inspired brotherhood into a fragmented network mirrors the evolution of the country's drug war itself. From ideology to survival, from belief to business. The men who once knelt in prayer before their missions now operate without pretense, guided not by scripture, but by the same ruthless instincts that define the trade. In the hills of Michoacán, traces of their presence still linger. Old safe houses, half-buried meth labs, and murals of saints painted beside bullet holes tell the story of a cartel that once tried to merge holiness with horror. The sermons of Nazario Moreno have faded into legend, yet their echoes remain in the fear and silence of those who lived through his rule. La Familia Michoacana began as a promise of order in a land abandoned by authority. It ended as a cautionary tale of how faith, when wielded by ambition, can sanctify even the darkest acts of violence.